Chapter 18, Evolution and the Origin of Species. Let me begin by saying that evolution is change, and change happens for either the good or the bad. Darwin, in the 1800s, published a book called The Origin of Species, which was based on his research of many life forms around the globe. And upon this, he was able to come up with a theory on how species change, and this is through natural selection. So, before Darwin in the 1800s, the ancient Greeks really had a philosophy that life was static and unchanging. This stayed the same until the 1700s, when the idea of change, of the possibility of change, started to take hold. Also in the 1700s, some scientists were brave enough to come forward and say that they believed that animals were really different in various populations, and this was indicative of changes. It wasn't until the 1800s where we saw that change was being proposed not only for living things, but also in non-living. Hutton in the 1800s said that there was geological change or change in the planet. And Lyell came to say that the earth is very, very old, and this was different from what had been proposed before. Also in the 1800s, Lamarck came up with the very first proposed mechanism for how change might occur. And he called this inheritance of acquired characteristics. Now, although he was correct in that species do change, his method was not quite right. He felt that you could have an individual that had a change, and therefore this change would then be passed on to their offspring. An example of this might be, for example, if someone colored their hair purple, we would not expect their offspring to have purple hair. Yet this is what Lamarck, in theory, was proposing. So along came Charles Darwin, and he was a naturalist, meaning he studied life, and he was hired to board the HMS Beagle, a ship which was going to circumnavigate the globe for 5 years, 1831 to 1836, and his job was going to be to record the various species found around the world. Now, as he did this, he started to notice that depending on the locations they visited, they found species which seemed to have remnants of ancestral characteristics, but were very different and very suited to their particular areas. And so he came to decide that this was a natural process, which he termed natural selection. But it wasn't until 1858, some almost 20 years or more later, that he actually published this idea. The reasoning was because this was not a popular idea of the time. There were lots of people who were very against the idea that living things changed from what God had placed on the earth. So what were some of Darwin's ideas? Well, in order for natural selection to be possible, he said that most characteristics are heritable. So most traits could be passed from a parent to the offspring. Number two was that offspring had to be produced in great numbers, more than can actually survive. Therefore, there has to be a competition for resources, for things to keep them alive. And the characteristics of the offspring will vary slightly. These variations are what are inherited. And so, therefore, individuals, based on what their variations might be, might have a better chance of survival. Now, from all this came the idea of adaptation, meaning that populations change. Now, make sure you understand it's not an individual. Populations can change to best suit their environment. And how do they do this? They do this through natural selection. So let's take a look at some of Darwin's ideas. They came from his observations, and here we see a number of birds which are of the finch group that he noticed in the Galapagos Islands, which is a chain of islands or an archipelago, which are off the coast of South America. So he noticed that on various islands, various birds would have different, slightly different beak shapes. And he also came to find out that these animals could not interbreed. Therefore, they were different species. Well, why did they have different beaks? Well, it would depend on the particular island's environment and what sort of food sources were present. So on islands where there was a plentiful amount of seeds, he found birds that had larger, wider beaks, which were better suited to cracking open seeds. Whereas on islands which were heavily populated by insects, he would find birds with sharper, more finer beaks, which were better adapted for catching insects. And so these birds were better suited for the food availability, that resource. They were then better able to survive on their particular islands, and over a great deal of time, those traits would be passed on to their offspring. So Darwin was finding out his material between 1831 and 1836, where Wallace was much later. Wallace is a much younger man, so he was not doing his research until the late 1840s, early 1850s, but they both proposed this idea of natural selection in London in 1858. And Darwin realized that if he didn't publish his ideas quickly, then he would essentially be scooped by Wallace. So Darwin did publish his material before Wallace and was able to get the credit for this idea of natural selection, and gets the credit over time. And for quite some time, Wallace was kind of forgotten by the scientific community. So again, what is this idea of natural selection, which a lot of people think of as survival of the fittest, but Darwin didn't actually call it survival of the fittest. It was someone else who did that later. Here's an example of natural selection. Darwin noticed that there were different tortoises on different Galapagos Islands. On the islands that were wet islands and had a lot of tall vegetation, he found that the tortoises had longer necks. Whereas on the islands that were very dry and had only low shrubby vegetation, the necks on the tortoises were shorter. Now, this wasn't some Lamarckian idea that said, okay, well, the tortoises must have stretched their necks on the wet islands, therefore that's how they were able to get to have longer necks. It's rather by the fact that randomly the tortoises that were born, because they had a genetic variant that gave them a longer neck, were able to survive in greater numbers on the wet islands, and therefore over time, and this is usually a long amount of time, they were able to survive in greater numbers, and therefore the populations shifted to having mostly tortoises with longer necks on wet islands. So let's overview some evidence which can point to the idea that evolution is a real thing. Well, there's this idea of divergent evolution versus convergent evolution. So divergent, I show a single point going away from each other. So this is the idea that you start with one ancestor and you end up with two different species that are not able to interbreed, that look very different from one another. So here's an example. We have an ancestral plant which evolves into two different species, say a grass species versus a rose species. Now, both species are plants, but they're really very different and look very, very different. Whereas in convergent evolution, we see that two species in the same area can evolve in order to have a similar trait, but really not be the same type of species at all. An example of this would be that we would have one ancestor that evolves into insects that can fly versus another ancestor which can evolve into having wings that can fly as in birds. Now, birds and insects are both animals, but they're very far apart from each other evolutionarily. But it was both beneficial for these types of animals to be able to fly, and so therefore they did evolve a similar ability, and yet they did not have a common ancestor. Another piece of evidence is the fossil record. Now, the fossil record, by looking at fossils, which are either preserved bones or preserved imprints of animals or plants, can show progress through time and changes. We have things called homologous structures. And I'm showing here the forearm of a human, and we notice that, the arm, it has an upper bone structure, then a forearm which has two bones, and then a hand which has many component bone structures. We can see in various other animals that they have a similar type of structure for their forearm. And I'll show you that in the next slide. Whereas vestigial structures is also evidence for common ancestors. I'm showing you here the whale. Now, whales and terrestrial animals do have a common ancestor because we can look in the whale body and we notice that whales have hip bones. Now, normally we think of hip bones as important for the lower extremities to attach in land animals. Well, why would whales need these? They don't walk. We find that they have these hip bones because they are more closely related to land animals than, say, other aquatic animals like fish, but they don't use them anymore. The hips. So vestigial structures are parts that no longer function but give us ideas of a common ancestor. The next is biogeography. Biogeography is shows that there because of land mass segregation and then subsequent breakup, we can track evidence of evolution. So at one point in time, all the land mass on the planet were all together in a structure called Pangea, but then Pangea broke up into the continents we know now: Africa, South America, North America, Eurasia, etc. And once this segregation happened, then the living species were separated from one another and could go on different evolutionary paths. And our last bit of evidence, which is some of our strongest modern day evidence, is molecular biology, where we can actually compare DNA sequences and see which species have the closest DNA map. So here's a pictorial representation of convergent or convergence or convergent evolution. We see here that we have animals that live in a similar environment, and they both have developed a white exterior. Here we have Arctic fox, and here we have white birds, the ptarmigans of the Arctic, which are both showing white so that they better suit their environment and they are less available to predators. And here we have some pictures of homologous structures. Homo means same. So there we see that in the human, the dog, the bird, and even the whale. In the extremities, we see a single bone which attaches to the main body, two bones which come next, and then a series of bones in the most distal part of the extremity. And you can match up the colors, and we see that we have the same thing in each of these very different species, therefore indicating a common ancestor. Okay, we've been talking about natural selection, which is what Darwin proposed, that because of variations within a group, a population, some individuals will be more likely to survive and therefore pass on their traits to their offspring. We have another type of selection called artificial selection. And here we see that artificial selection does happen, but it happens because humans have intervened in the breeding of certain species. They get involved in the breeding, and therefore they choose the mates, and this does not allow for natural choice of mating. And we've seen this in plant groups, in crops, and also in domesticated animals, where humans will choose and selectively breed certain individuals to force the phenotypes that we particularly want. So here are some misconceptions that we may see in evolution. So these are some things that we have proven are not true. So the first one is that evolution is just a theory. Now, we use the term theory in common language as being a guess, or a hypothesis. Well, in scientific terms, a theory is a well-proven application. And so we have looked over and over again, and this idea that populations change has been a well-proven application. The next thing that has been proven not true is that individuals evolve. Now that's not true. Only populations can evolve. Once an individual is born or brought to life, it does not change genetically, at least not yet. If, with time, we may be able to change our DNA, but individuals do not change genetically. Therefore, it's only populations that change based on suitability of certain individuals to their environment. The next thing that can be disproven is evolution explains the origins of life. How life started on this planet, we really don't know. How that very first cell came to be. So evolution does not explain this. We have some ideas, but we don't really know for sure. And the last thing that has been disproven is that organisms evolved on purpose. No, changes are random. At least most changes are random. This is if we're talking about natural selection. And only some of these changes will be helpful. Genetic change does not come about because of an environmental change. By that I mean genetic change within an individual. Because remember, that genetic change happened when that individual was born only. So organisms cannot evolve. Okay, so how does a new species form? Well, first let's look at the definition of a species. A species is a group of organisms that can interbreed and produce viable, fertile offspring. So what do those last terms mean? Well, viable means alive. So you need to produce something that's alive. Fertile means that eventually that offspring will be able to reproduce itself. So, an example of a species is Homo sapiens, us. Example of another species is dogs or cats. Those are individual species. They can interbreed a dog with a dog and produce viable, fertile offspring. Now, what's a hybrid? Sometimes two very closely related species can interbreed and produce something that is viable. Often though, and in most cases, that offspring cannot reproduce itself. So an example of this would be a horse and a donkey. Those are two different species, but they can mate. They can produce offspring, but that offspring, a mule, is not able to give birth itself. It cannot produce offspring. So a hybrid does not mean it's a new species. Another example is a tiger and a lion producing a liger. A liger is sterile and cannot produce offspring. So what's a gene pool? Well, we talked about this a little bit last semester. A gene pool would be the collection of all of the variable genes in a species, all the variants. So the different variety for each gene, and each variety gives each individual a slightly different adaptation or ability to survive in an environment. So how did Darwin see speciation on his voyages? Well, we know this. This is an actual drawing from Darwin's work, and he is showing that starting with an original and ancestral species, that using pieces of evidence like fossils, you can see the changes that occurred as new species were formed. Here is a representation of the eventual resulting elephants that we know today from their ancestral species. So you see one species, and it is going to evolve into two different species. And sometimes you can have more than two evolve at the same time. Then this species will evolve into two new species. Now, these two species cannot interbreed. They are separate species in most cases. And over usually a very large amount of time, we see the evolution of new species. Sometimes this evolution can occur quickly if there's a massive change in an environment, which results in a big die-off of almost all of the species, leading to only certain variants. So what are some of the technical ways that speciation occurs? Well, we have allopatric speciation and sympatric speciation. These are ways in which new species come about. Patric means homeland. We see that is in both of these words. Then we see allo at the beginning of this word, and that means different, where sim means the same. So this is the evolution of different species because they're in different places and they have a physical barrier between them. Whereas sympatric means that species will arise if they are still all together in the same geographical area. So let's look at allopatric speciation. Well, populations move. So groups of organisms may move a great distance and be now separated by large distances. Or individuals may be separated by a natural occurrence like a river or a mountain range. Also, there is something called adaptive radiation, where we see that if species are separated, we may see the creation of one species to many different variety of species that cannot interbreed. Remember, if you're a different species, you can't interbreed. Whereas sympatric speciation happens in the same geographical area, this either comes about by errors in chromosome numbers that happen during cell division. We talked about that last semester. Or by reproductive isolation, reproductively isolating. While the organisms remain together, they are no longer able to breed. So let's look at these possibilities. So here's an example of allopatric speciation. We have two species of owls that had a common ancestor, but they live in very different areas. This particular owl, the northern spotted owl, live in the northwest of the United States, whereas the Mexican spotted owl is found in the southern western regions and Mexico, southern western regions of the United States and Mexico. There is a great distance between these, as well as very different ecosystems that they find. So these species cannot interbreed. Then we mentioned adaptive radiation. So in these particular bird species from Hawaii, these are called honey creepers, there was a founder species, so an ancestor, but depending upon the different islands where these birds reside, we see that they have evolved again based on their ability to find particular food sources in their particular areas. But they're separated by being on different islands. Now, sympatric means they're in the same geographical area, and there was two basic ways, either changes in chromosomes or impeding reproduction. So let's look at changes in chromosomes. Aneuploidy means you have too few chromosomes. So this occurs during meiosis and the creating of gametes. So here's the normal path where we end up with one copy of every chromosome in a gamete, and then we put two gametes together and we get back to 2N. Well, if we have an extra chromosome tagging along during meiosis, when this gamete combines with a normal gamete, we're going to have an extra chromosome. So we have 2N plus 1. If we lose a chromosome in meiosis, then we have a gamete missing a chromosome. And when it combines with a normal gamete, we have 2N plus 1. So can these organisms create a new species? Well, in the text it asks, which of these two situations do you think might be more likely to survive and go on to produce a new species, because it will have a different number of chromosomes. Autopolyploidy, this means where you don't have just a number a change in the number of chromosomes, either one chromosome too many or one chromosome too few, but you actually duplicate the entire chromosome set. Now, this is very common in plants, and so you have a diploid parent, and when it produces offspring, you have 4 sets of chromosomes instead of the normal 2. This can result in viable plants, whereas this doesn't usually happen in animals. And it would be a new variety. An allopolyploid means that you have gametes from 2 different species combined. Again, this is very rare, but it can occur in plants. And so here we see that we have species 1, and it has a normal gamete, and species 2 has a polyploid gamete, has extra copies. We see that in the first mating, we end up with a polyploid gamete in the first organism that's formed, and this is only if it's able to reproduce. And then we have to have a second mating with a normal gamete in order to form a new set of diploid chromosome number. Now, the other kind of sympatric is actually isolating organisms reproductively, even though they all live together. So how can we do that? Well, there are pre-zygotic methods and post-zygotic methods. So what does this mean? Well, pre means before, post means after. Zygotic means fertilization, the coming together of an egg and a sperm. So how can we isolate individuals, keep them from having their eggs and sperm come together? Well, temporal isolation is one way. This is when species have different breeding schedules. So if one breeds in the fall and one breeds in the spring, then these species are never even going to be interested in each other. Habitat isolation, even though they're within the same geographical area, they may prefer certain habitats versus other habitats. So certain types within the same geographical area, a sandy area versus a grassy area. Behavioral isolation means that certain species perform certain acts to attract mates, like dances or songs. And if they don't have the right dance or song, then that other species isn't going to be interested in them. And then the last type is gametic barrier, for which I have some slides, meaning that there's reproductive structures which don't match up. And so literally the 2 species can't mate because they're physically unable to transfer gametes to one another. Postzygotic means we actually allow an embryo to be produced. But within that, we have hybrid inviability, meaning that even though the embryo is produced, the egg and sperm come together, the embryo will not survive. It will die quickly. Hybrid sterility means that different species do produce a viable offspring, like the horse and the donkey produce a mule, but that offspring cannot itself reproduce. Here is from the text showing an example of temporal isolation. So we have 2 different frog species. They cannot reproduce, and that's because they reproduce at different times of the year. And so they're not interested in reproducing when the other is. Here's an example of habitat isolation. Here are 2 different insects, crickets, and this one prefers sandy soil habitat. This one produces a grassy soil habitat. So they're not going to even be near each other, even though they live in the same general area. And here are we'll have two slides for gametic barriers. These are male reproductive organs among different types of damselflies. This is a type of insect. So they come from different species of damselflies. They will not match up with the females of a different group. And here we see gametic barrier in plants. We have different shaped flowers, which is the reproductive structure of a flower. And this one is conducive to pollination because gametes are not joined together by the plant itself. We need a pollinator. And so these particular flowers are pollinated by bees, and these are pollinated by birds. And so therefore, you'll never get a cross-pollination between these two species. Okay, and that concludes Chapter 18 on evolution.